Welcome, everyone, to Counterpoint Apologetics. And tonight we are having a special guest on that is of high esteem in our eyes. He has absolutely awesome credentials and I view of one of high integrity. Dr. Dustin R. Smith, a New Testament scholar whose research focuses on early Christology and the Jewish intellectual world of the New Testament. His work examines how Jesus is understood within the Second Temple Judaism and the earliest Christian communities. He's also the host of the Biblical Unitarian podcast, and he wrote the book on Wisdom Christology in the book of John. And he also just recently wrote a book on systematic Christology, systematic theology in the early church, which I just purchased last week, thanks to Brother Nero, who recommended the book. And so far I've engaged in that, and I've truly loved it. And I wanted to add in my guest tonight, Dr. Dustin Smith. I truly appreciate you coming on. Appreciate you. Introduce yourself beyond what I've already added, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I appreciate it. It's nice to meet you and all of our other guests here. And I'm just happy to be here to talk about my work. I'm honored that people would want to engage with my rantings and writing. So I'm grateful to be here, and thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I saw you. I've of course already had your book for quite a while, and it was one of the probably one of the first strict books I've ever read on wisdom. Even though I've had other books that I've engaged with in sections that deal with that, but I thought it was a very good book. And I've always had a form of wisdom Christology, but I thought your book was excellent on the subject, and I truly appreciate you coming on. And we're also having a panel of guests to engage with Dr. Smith on wisdom Christology, because we do find this to be an important discussion. And this is about wisdom Christology, but it's also a comparative theology type of live we're doing. This is to engage Dr. Smith with his book, and also for Oneness and Unitarians to come together and say, hey, where do we agree? Obviously, there's some disagreement, but we all can do that in brotherly kindness and love toward each other. And that's what we promote here. Always do. We love academics. We have Trinitarian friends. We have Unitarian friends. Love each other. You can disagree without destroying each other, and that's what we're promoting. So I will add on also a panel of guests. Elder Brandon Nero. Hey. How you doing, sir?
Good. Glad to be here. Salutations to everyone. I am excited about this conversation tonight. Wisdom Christology is an area that really excites me.
Thank you, sir. And our other, Timothy Smith.
Hey, everyone. Just glad to be here and to discuss a subject that I know that we're all interested in. I'm very excited. So good to be here.
Yes, we had a previous live where we engaged with these two gentlemen because they wrote papers for the Urshan Graduate School of Theology. And part of their research included Dr. Dustin Smith's book, of which they always had very high remarks for and they had great respect for. And as soon as this opportunity came up, every one of us were absolutely yes. And he's also engaged with Brother Brandon Nero as well on his live. So please check out the Biblical Unitarian podcast, Brother Nero's site and channel on YouTube as well. Where they had that discussion, because that was a wonderful discussion, and I truly enjoyed it. So we also will have Moses on as well. So he will be engaging in the discussions shortly. Dr. Dustin Smith, could you just go over your general point of your book? Obviously, just give a skim of what your intentions were, and what the focus point toward later creedal aspects were in trying to negate probably more of a Jewish mindset when it came to who Jesus was, the relationship to God, the Old Testament, and those potential issues that you saw.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a huge question. It's still an ongoing debate in New Testament scholarship, the correct way in which to articulate Christology within the New Testament. And really what I feel like in this book is I'm actually taking a lot of scholarship that's been out there in the academic world for really over 100 years, and I've tried to distill it in a way that's accessible to what I would call motivated lay persons. And the thesis of the book is that one of the primary Christological portrayals in the fourth gospel, the gospel according to John, is that Jesus is the embodiment, and I'm even comfortable saying the incarnation of God's pre-existent wisdom. Despite the fact that the noun Sophia doesn't appear anywhere in the Gospel of John, I think that those original readers of the Gospel of John that were familiar with the portrayals of God's wisdom and how God's wisdom was closely related to God's personified word, they would see that Jesus is being portrayed in terms of things that were formerly said about God's wisdom in a variety of Jewish sources. And so this, of course, raises the question of how we interpret preexistence and how we understand the humanity of Jesus in the Gospel of John, which, of course, naturally deals with how we understand the full identity of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And too often, I think, in common circles or in internet circles with the armchair theologians, there are too many people that just they default to the creedal Christologies, whether it's Nicaea or Constantinople or Chalcedon, and they take that and they read that back into the Gospel of John, particularly its prologue. And that's just historically anachronistic. You're not supposed to do that. You can't take 5th century ideas and force a 1st century reader or 4th century document to say those sort of things. That's just ridiculous. I like to use this example a lot, where Pharaoh gave Abraham some camels. I don't think that means that he gave Abraham a box of smokes. Okay, that's just not what camels meant back in that time period. Okay, you could steal that one, by the way. That's good.
Absolutely.
So, I'm just trying to portray Jesus in the Gospel of John in the way that I think that the author was trying to portray him, which is seeing Jesus as the embodiment of God's wise interaction and his instruction to his creation. And really, wisdom Christology is something that appears in nearly every other book of the New Testament. But my opinion, at least the argument in the book, is I try to demonstrate that the fullest expression of wisdom Christology does appear in the Gospel according to John out of all the books in the New Testament.
Awesome. That is one of the primary things that I really enjoyed in your book. And I know having discussions with Tim and Brother Nero as well, it was very refreshing to step away from the whole Greek mindset and trying to force certain aspects on it, but coming from a coming forward view instead of an anachronistic forcing from the Greek thought and mindset to Jewish thought. It seems just extremely awkward. Obviously, historically, you're going to have some type of overlap in type of teachings, but it was very refreshing to read your book and get a background on that. I wanted to add Moses to the top to our panel. Hey, Moses, how you doing? Hopefully his mic's working. All right. His mic's probably not working. Tim and Brother Nero, what would you like to add to his interactions on and what he said?
Yeah, and of course I have the book and I've gone through it and made all my categorizations and really thinking about it. One of the things I think probably restate a little bit of what Chris said. I think it was very refreshing to see the approach that was made, because I think, especially within apologetic context, we're so used to going back and trying to argue and trying to argue the Greek out of the text. But from what I can discern reading it, it's like you pick up from a course, the Second Temple period understanding of a Jew and how would they understand this? What was their thought process? Which I think has really been missing, at least on the larger scale, is the overall larger conversation of how was wisdom understood? How was it interpreted? And what were they communicating and saying some of the things they were saying? I think, and I'm going to keep saying in apologetic settings, I think that has been probably embarrassingly silent in the conversation, which I think that needs to change.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I've always been very interested in like kind of reconstructing and understanding the context of Paul, because there was a lot of times when when I was in high school and even early years of college where I'd have Trinitarians come up to me and be like, oh, if oneness is correct, then why aren't you, and they were very dogmatic about it, and there were some points that they had, but when I read the text I realized like, yeah, it doesn't make sense either from a Trinitarian standpoint. And then like, so I try to really dig into the text and understand. And there's a lot of things that people will take certain statements and but then leave out the full reasoning of Paul, because that was one of my big things is Paul and the Torah. And it's like, yeah, even Paul's direct statement here wouldn't make sense with all the backfilling of information that they're trying to make if you're kind of not understanding his line of reasoning or from a first century context from Paul. And that goes same for John and Wisdom Christology. So all this is outroot from like my studies on Paul and kind of coming into like John, trying to understand him within his context. So I always appreciated that approach. I think it will best fit what we're trying to do for the text.
One of the interesting questions I had for Dr. Smith, and this is kind of a little bit, looking backwards, but when we look at Proverbs 8 and some other references in especially in the first two chapters of your book, obviously, I think one of the reasons why Wisdom Christology has taken a backseat is because of the beating that Trinitarians took in the first centuries with Arius. I don't think they liked how Proverbs 8 framed wisdom. And I still don't, because when you read the whole reality of it's pick and choose, right? We want a little bit of this, but we don't want any of that over here. What is your view on how that was used, and also how today it's just not a good area to try for them to go? Obviously, they don't. They stick with Logos, more Logos Christology. But what areas do you think is very detrimental from a theological standpoint?
Well, there's an interesting development in how people were reading Proverbs chapter 8. I can tell you right now, because I've got about a dozen or 13 modern commentaries on the book of Proverbs, and I've worked at institutions with other people that have written commentaries on Proverbs. So I know some colleagues that are specialists on this. I don't consider myself a specialist, but I've tried to do everything I can to become as well informed as I can on the topic. And the modern consensus is that the portrayal of wisdom in particularly Proverbs chapters 1, 8, and 9 is that this is a personification, and that this personification is not a real conscious female person alongside Yahweh in heaven. That is the consensus. In fact, there are some evangelical commentaries now that actually say reading Jesus into this is wrong and you shouldn't do it. So they're pushing back on their own people, saying that's, and I applaud them. That's good. And generally, the Old Testament scholars, they're better at that sort of stuff. So that's good. You can start to see, and actually in the conclusion of my Wisdom Christology book, and I probably should put this up here. This is, and I didn't get permission to do this, but since I've been invited to talk about it, I think people should kind of see at least what I'm talking about, when we're referring to this particular book. And in the final chapter, I try to answer the question to the best of my ability. Where did things go wrong? Because you're interested kind of in history, and you start to see that some of the early writings in the 2nd century, maybe even in the 1st century, still were understanding wisdom as a personification, and they still understood the Gospel of John and using it that particular way. But as soon as you get to someone like Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century, so we're now 50, 55, maybe 60 years after the writing of the Gospel of John, things have changed. But Justin Martyr tells us in his writings that he is presupposing his Greek philosophical background and that he's using that to read the text. So we know that he definitely brought that baggage in his understanding of the Logos. So that's where things started to change, is that they took the person of Jesus and they moved him back into prehistory. The Logos was not just God's personified speech or God's creative and powerful word, and now became a conscious being, the Son. Now, for Justin Martyr, it was still a created being, and that actually is the impression you would get when you read the Septuagint, Proverbs chapter 8, verse 22, where it says, the Lord created me. This is wisdom speaking, personified wisdom speaking in the first person. The Lord created me, which is, there's actually an open debate as to whether that's what the Hebrew actually means, because there's an ambiguous verb in Hebrew in Proverbs 8, verse 22, which could either mean that the Lord Yahweh acquired me or Yahweh created me. Now, if you're the Septuagint translator, granted, this is all before the New Testament time, you have to make a decision, because there's not a Greek verb that means both to acquire or to create. And so that translator understood it as creating. And so Justin Martyr took that and said, okay, well, the Logos is the first created thing, the first, like literally the firstborn of all creation, the first created thing in time before the Genesis creation. We actually could start to see in like the 4th century to where they actually would describe Proverbs 8 in referring to the ministry of Jesus, which is really odd and really strange. And I don't have those writers off the top of my head because I'm not a specialist in the 4th century. But I do know that by that time, like things have just kind of, we've moved so far, away from the target. We're tone deaf, and we've lost touch with what Proverbs is trying to do. There's a lot of anti-Semitism that's going on there. There's a lot of we don't like the Jewish people. We don't like the Old Testament. The Old Testament is old, bad, therefore irrelevant. And so that it kind of colors the way that I think people were reading that sort of stuff there. But I mean, I can go on and talk about that for a long time, but let me kind of pause and let you all respond to me.
Well, I do want to ask, because and it's interesting, because I was thinking about this the other day with Justin Martyr, especially seeing, the window of Middle Platonism, and also considering like Philo, his objective to speak to Alexandrian Jews. Do you think the assumption he made was maybe more of a natural thing that took place, him having that philosophical, or was it more as intentional reverse engineering? Because if I'm trained and I think it was like, oh, wait a minute, this is already in ways that can fit into my category, so this must be what they're thinking. Do you think that was more natural, or is it just, or did he have to, I guess, hard jamming in there as we can obviously see it is?
Yeah, I tend to not want to attribute malice to the intentions of people. When I read Justin Martyr, and I actually just this last year, I really spent the time to take, I was able to get a hold of the Greek text and just really work through the whole thing. And I have enough training where I can do that with a little bit of help, but just really trying to understand his thought process, trying to figure out what did he believe, because it doesn't really do me any good for someone else to tell me what he believes. I want to read in his own writings, in the original language, what he actually said. I don't think that he is intentionally trying to force this foreign concept into the scriptures. I just don't think that he has taken the time to really repent of this philosophical framework, and he's taking this baggage, and he's basically, he's decided he's not going to take off those lenses through which he's going to read the text. And we all have our own biases and our own glasses that we're wearing because we're 21st century Western Americans that speak English primarily, and we're reading, first century documents that are not written in English, or reading, things from the Hebrew Bible that are written in Hebrew and Aramaic, which, as far as I know, most people don't read Aramaic anymore. You might know a little bit of Hebrew. So you have to be very, very intentional when interpreting history to not commit historical anachronism. And some people are aware of those pitfalls, and they work really, really hard to avoid that. That's why in the book, I really labor to set out my methodology. I say, I'm building it up from the Hebrew Bible, building it up from the Jewish sources. And I'm not even getting to the Gospel of John until we've established that foundation. We've established that framework. And that way you can just, you can criticize it all you want, but at least that's the evidence that we have, and we're going to build out of it. And it's just a lot of work. And unfortunately, there are a lot of Bible teachers that, it's kind of like the drive-through the fast food joint. If they don't get their answers in 5 minutes, they want it for free, and they don't want to do the hard work. And there's too many people that are lazy, unfortunately. None of you, I'm sure. I'm sure you're all astute students of the Bible.
Try our best,
Yeah.
So many hours in the day, but you give as much as you can, and that's why we truly enjoy you being on. And because there's no fear in interacting with people that you may disagree with on some things. You may agree on 95%. Enjoy their, especially enjoy their interactions. Grow from it. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's why we're here. Tim, I know you had some questions that you want to interact with on different areas of his book. Again, everyone, I highly recommend his book.
Yeah,
really for sure. So when it comes, since we're on Proverbs 8, when it comes to the idea of created, and from both our viewpoint, like if it's a personification of God's attributes, what do you think the author of Proverbs 8 is doing there by calling wisdom created?
So I actually think that the Hebrew, even though an ambiguous verb is used there, I'm not so sure that the intention of the author of Proverbs 8 is to give two different readings of it. I think it's just the author used a verb that just happened to have two meanings, but we're told elsewhere in Proverbs that we are supposed to acquire and get wisdom, but not create wisdom. So I think the natural way is that, how could the author encourage his male readers that they need to acquire wisdom? Well, if God did it at the beginning of his creation, then certainly you should do it as well. So that's the reason why I think that even though the verb is grammatically ambiguous, probably the intention of the author was acquire, and then it just seems that the Septuagint translator, whatever, 300, 400, however many years later, took it a different way, or that's how he interpreted it, and that's fine. That's his, that's his constitutional right.
Yeah. Do you have like ideas or any kind of like intuition in your reading of like different sources of why the Septuagint translator would have done it that way, or you just know that's what happened and you kind of left it at that?
Yeah, it's you're always looking at what sort of things could have influenced somebody,
right?
And dating the timing of the translation of the Ketuvim, the writings, because the translation of the Septuagint didn't all just happen at one time. They began with the Torah, and then they moved to the prophets, which is like we have a different way of understanding the prophets, and then the writings were like the last things that were translated, and that could have been first century BC. So we have some Jewish works that have drawn on Proverbs that elaborate on this wisdom tradition, such as books like Sirach, which also kind of bring this out a little bit. So it could be that the author, I don't even know how I could prove it to you at this point.
Yeah, that's why I was asking intuitionally, because I know there's, at that point you're doing a kind of like a judgment call. So I was just wondering what your judgment call was on it. Yeah. I'm not expecting you to like lay it out like, this is 100%. I'm just was wondering like, what was in your research, what was kind of the feeling that you got with it? Like, oh, this seems like the most likely option, or do you didn't pick one?
One of the things that I'm comfortable doing as a biblical scholar is saying, I don't know. Because the last thing I want to do is to feel like I have to give you an answer to a question because I need to feel like I'm the expert. And so I have to if I don't know, I'm just going to tell you I don't know. I'm not going to make up something and lie to you.
For sure.
I'd rather be honest with you about that whole thing. But that's a question. Like, I don't know if we can know the answer to that. I think it's just an impossible question to answer. I'm not aware of any sort of good reason as to why that is, and it's extremely difficult to get back into the mind.
Oh, yeah, we hear you, Moses.
Okay.
You hear me?
Yeah, it's difficult to get back in the mind of ancient persons, especially when we have no idea who this translator of Proverbs was in the Septuagint.
Fair point.
So it's a good question, though.
Thank you.
And I do truly appreciate you saying that, because watching your podcast, I have noticed that you're very straightforward. If I don't know, I'm not going to force something that something I can't prove, and that's one of the reasons why I have great respect for you. Moses, do you have anything you wanted to add or ask?
Yeah. One of the things that I thought was very interesting, because you mentioned the 4th century, was actually, I'll save that a little bit for later. I was reading J.D. Kelly. I'm not sure if you've read his Early Christian History. Really good book. And on page 135, he talks about how Dionysius of Alexandria kind of elaborates on the interpretations of Proverbs and a lot of wisdom literature. And according to Psalms chapter 109 and 3 in the Septuagint, it says, "Before the dawn I begat thee out of my belly." And also in the Septuagint of Proverbs 8:25, it says, "Before all the hills he begets me." So if we are identifying Jesus as wisdom, I guess, where would you say John 1 and 1 take, when rather would you say John 1 and 1 takes place? Because if we're understanding Psalms chapter 109 and 3 in the Septuagint to be before the dawn, I begat thee out of my belly, what would be the dawn, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So the interesting thing, and I would need to go back and look at this, because I've looked at it a while back. I think that there's a corruption in the Septuagint of, I think Psalm 109 is really Psalm 110 in the English, if I'm not mistaken. But the Hebrew does not say that. The original Hebrew is very clear, but I think there's a corruption in the Greek. So it's hard for me to build an argument on the Greek Septuagint. Now, when it comes to the Gospel of John, which I imagine at some point we do want to talk about, we could talk about
Right.
wisdom all we want, or Proverbs, but the John 1:1 is very clear. It was in the beginning, that the Word just kind of always was there, which is natural. If you got the Creator, naturally the Creator's speech, in my opinion, his creative and powerful Word is naturally always going to be with them. So now granted, there are a variety of Jewish texts that talk about God's wisdom that was there in the beginning. So some of them will say wisdom was just kind of always there with God because it's God's own wisdom. He always has it. Others will say it was created. So there's a fluidity in the understanding of the different Jewish writers on this particular topic, probably due to the fact that there's ambiguity in Proverbs 8 verse 22 in that particular verb, that's understandable. I get it. So. But John 1:1 is very, very clear. The Word always was there.
So would you say it was existing or eternally existing? Would you see this as an ad intra reality to God or an ad extra reality of God in John 1:1? I
just think the wording of it just kind of indicates that in the beginning was the Word. Whatever you want to define the beginning was, the Word was already there. Now, granted, I do try to situate that in something that I think is something that is familiar to the readers, because I am 100% convinced that when John 1:1 says in the beginning, and he talks about God as the creator and creating through the Word and creating life and light and humanity, he is very deliberate in drawing his readers to be thinking about Genesis chapter 1. Okay, so we know what that beginning is. Okay, like in fact, just in John 1, the opening line, "And our he," is a direct quotation from Genesis 1:1 in the Septuagint. So again, just like all of those themes, I think it seems, I don't know, what else could he mean by that?
How do you feel about the assertion that John 1 and 1 is talking about the beginning of the ministry of Christ?
I think you would really have to divorce it from all of those clear parallels with Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and that is a minority view among biblical Unitarians, and some of those people are my friends, so I got to be careful how I word these sort of things there. But and when I try to have conversation with them, they tend to be tone deaf to these parallels. Also, again, if I was to ask you, okay, what passage is being talked about which has in the beginning with God being creator, God creating with his Word, God creating life, God creating light, and God creating humanity? All those themes are there in the first few verses of the prologue, and they're also there in Genesis chapter 1, especially when you have the quotation of it. To say, well, we're going to ignore all of that and put it to the ministry of Jesus, I just think it's at some point you're deliberately trying to, and I know why they do this is because they've seen Trinitarians abuse John chapter 1 verse 1, and they're doing this knee-jerk reaction, and they're saying, well, it can't refer to that, it has to refer to something else. The problem is that it just you divorce it from all those parallels, and you got to take those parallels seriously. And just, I mean, I think I have something like 90 commentaries on the Gospel of John. I'm not aware of any of the serious ones that are even entertaining this as an option these days. So it's just a fringe view.
Mhm.
So,
And considering that aspect that you just brought up, the knee-jerk reaction, as oneness proponents, we truly understand the knee-jerk reactions to defending your faith, right? And as I agree with your point. In the scale of probability, it's very low on the probability scale, just because of context and things like that. I mean, is there a possibility that it could be that? Yeah, but the likelihood is, how I always, measure things. Everyone has an interpretation, right? Everyone has a theology by which they're trying to, and there's a reason why people say things. Now, the probability of the reason there is, whether it's true or not, is a whole different thing. So, Tim, you were going to say something?
No, because I remember I was kind of playing with that idea at one point before I kind of landed on like a wisdom Christology more. And it was because, partially, it wasn't I would say I would divorce the context of Genesis, but I was at one point thinking like it's possible that John could be using the context of Genesis to show that just as God did creation, now he brings about new creation through the man Jesus. And the reason why I was thinking that at one point was towards the end of John when Jesus breathed on them the breath of life. It kind of shows just as God breathed in the first Adam the breath of life for original creation, he breathed on them, or through the Spirit for new creation. But like you said, I agree with you. Ultimately, there was too many hurdles that can I jump over to make that the primary context, particularly. And I wanted to get to that with John's prologue, verses like 12 and 13, when it talks about wisdom kind of being among the Logos, kind of being among his people. I see that more so in line with wisdom kind of going to Israel through like the Torah and then calling out to them, than more so Jesus physically being there already. But would you kind of have to accept the latter view more to kind of bring I would say a solely new creationist view, if that makes sense. I still see new creation overtones, but I agree with you. It cannot be the primary context. Too many hurdles.
yeah, and there's no doubt that the prologue does jump into that eventually, because the purpose of the prologue is to show the ministry of how God is working with his creation through his logos. Okay. And so the logos is there active in creation. The logos becomes embodied in Jesus, and the logos continues to function in that ministry. And then by the end of the prologue in verse 18, you have Jesus, who currently right now is in the bosom of the Father, and he is exegeting, he is explaining the unseen God at that time, which is really kind of drawing back to John 1:1, to where the Word was with God and the Word was fully expressive of God. So it does actually get to that, okay? But it's the question is not, is it original creation or new creation? That's a false dichotomy, okay? Because it begins with the original creation and the ministry of the Logos, and then it moves into the way that the Logos continues to work in history, which naturally works with Jesus, okay? And so again, everybody knows the opening verse of the Bible. Everyone knows that. And so when you're going to begin with that, to say, well, no, it doesn't refer to that,
it's a hard hill to climb.
It's like, how much more obvious could the author have made it? So, and it's not just that too, because we have several other Jewish portrayals of God creating all things with his word. That's just the most natural way that you would read that. And yet you don't have any parallels in the New Testament, the new creation, of God creating all things, by the way, all things without qualification. In fact, he says, all things were made through the word, and nothing that was made apart from this word. So, I mean, all things, and by the way, nothing was left out of that. You can't say that with the new creation, because the new creation doesn't, recreate all things. There's still wickedness and sin that eventually is going to be destroyed. So anyway,
I get that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know how people completely reject a Genesis background, even from a new creation view. Like, I would never, even in the beginning, like when I was kind of thinking that way, it seems like he's obviously pulling back to creation, but also with the assumption that the Logos automatically equates to Jesus in John 1:1. I think that's been a lot of issues. Like, we can't accept that what's the word I'm looking for? So I'm a little dyslexic. Sometimes I can't pronounce words well. If you know what I'm talking about, the assumption, basically.
Yeah.
Someone assuming something to be true, and if they're trying to deny one assumption of a Trinitarian, but also accepting, and I see oneness doing this a lot, accepting the other assumption that automatically Jesus is the Logos in John 1:1. That's not really following the prologue.
Exactly right.
In my opinion.
That's a good point. Dr. Smith, one quick question. In John 1:18, do you see that as a post-resurrection statement?
Yes. Yes,
glorification. Okay, I do as well. I just want to make sure, because I think Trinitarians try to jump it back into pre-existence and all this other stuff, where I see that as a new creation or redemptive aspect of creation and the gateway by which Christ brings that forth. So, okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you were this is how you perceive that. In total, nothing changed or anything. Is there anything that you want to highlight through John 1:1 through 14, 18, right through there? Yeah, we got you, Moses.
Okay.
Anything you wanted to say?
Are you asking me?
Concerning John 1 through 14 or through 18.
I don't feel that my position has changed much. I've gotten some good feedback on it, because one of the things that I think I've become more open to, and probably today, I'm probably 50-50 on this, since that John 1:14, where the Word became flesh, I used to be pretty convinced that was referring to the birth of Jesus. Because you have the enfleshment, okay, you have the flesh part there, and that's the first time where he's the monogenes, he's the unique one of the Father, meaning he's the Son of God. Okay, so that just naturally sounds like the birth of Jesus. But the other side is that a strong argument has been made to me that this could also refer to the baptism, because particularly the baptism, that's where Jesus is declared by the voice from heaven that you are my Son, you are the Son of God, you are declared to be the Messiah, and naturally the Spirit comes upon Jesus and empowers him. It coronates him for his ministry. So I leave that open. I think it's I think there's good arguments that could be made either way. So I don't think that when I wrote that chapter, and even though it was published in April of 2024, that was all written probably a year earlier. At that point, I was more convinced on the birth of Jesus aspect of it there, but now I'm a little bit more open, because I'm, this is one of the differences. You'll have to respect, or you'll have to excuse me on this thing. The differences, I think, between an apologist and a scholar is that a scholar has to change his mind when he has new information given to him, and is always searching for the truth. I feel like sometimes apologists, they already have their truth figured out, and they have to dig their heels in. They have to defend it no matter what. I'm open to being wrong. I'm willing to change my mind and to admit if I've overlooked some evidence there. So that's why I like listening to people give me feedback, because if something was not persuasive, then I need to hear that. And I hear, okay, this argument was not very, very good. I need to go back to the drawing board. So I appreciate all of you for engaging with me.
Absolutely. I would say, on that, I understand. I've heard that discussion as well, brought up from different, friends that are Unitarians. And, I would say that I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both. I think being brought forth is unique to all the situations, even the resurrection. So I don't think it's just one. I think it's more than one in what it means to be brought forth. Everything is meant, whether it's ministry, whether it's the first begotten from the dead, or whatever. I think all of those fall in line. I don't think it's necessitating an either or situation. So I understand why you're saying that. I absolutely understand, because it does fit the profile of that also. And I do know Jerome, when he was asked about this, and they were discussing eternal sonship, and one of the things that they argued historically was that there was a different version of that in Luke that says they take the scripture, "This day I've begotten thee," right? So that in itself is proof that that text potentially was originally in there. Of course, there's various views in the different gospels, right? But that's another historical point that we won't get in here, but you may want to look into. So, Moses, do you have something?
Yeah. When I speaking on that, there was an interesting quotation from is a title "Gods and the One God" by
Oh,
Robert
you're breaking
Grant.
up a little bit, Moses.
Can you hear me?
It's a little chattery, a little
Okay.
breaking up.
1 second. Is it better now?
Keep talking.
Testing, testing. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Testing, testing.
Yeah.
Is it still staticky, or is it better?
That's better. It's a lot better. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. But what I was mentioning the book "Gods and the One God" by Professor Robert Grant, and there's a quotation in there where it talks about the gospel of and the only reason I mention this is because the gospel of the Hebrews, in that there's a Coptic fragment that's preserved in Jerome that speaks about the baptism of Jesus, and it says, and I want to quote this really quick. It's on page 142. It says, "There were also Christians whose ideas about the Spirit and the origin of Jesus did not win broad favor. And these people, especially in Egypt, read the Gospel of the Hebrews, which expresses the singular doctrine of the work of the Spirit, notably in fragments that came down in Coptic or were cited in Jerome origin. And the Coptic fragment, not necessarily primitive, read thus: When Christ wished to come upon the earth to men, the good Father summoned a mighty power in heaven, which was called Michael, and entrusted Christ to care thereof. And power came into the world, and it was carried, and it was called Mary, and Christ was in her womb 7 months."
No,
This kind of
yeah.
story. You said what? Am I
You're kind
still
of
getting
breaking
that?
up.
Yeah, you're going in and out a little bit. It's really static.
Yeah.
Is it better?
It's just like it's just
It's like when you say one word, it's fine, but when you start talking like what
Yeah,
you're
it's
trying to
dropping.
talk, it starts getting rougher and rougher as you go.
Gotcha. 1 second.
Real quick, go on, Brother Nero.
Yeah, and I was thinking on some of your thoughts related to pre-existence, especially within the context of the prologue. And I was going to say, I identify very much what you're saying. I think a lot of our, sometimes Christologies, we can have an overreaction. And I think sometimes, at least from the one side, that sometimes the overcorrection has been trying to avoid grammar sometimes, which I don't always think is very helpful. But you made an interesting statement on page 15 of your book, where you said Paul's thought was not so much that Christ pre-existed as the mediator of the Father's creative work, but that the pre-existent wisdom now being recognized is now being recognized as Christ. And when I was reading that, I thought that was such a profound point that a lot of people really miss the comparison that Paul is bringing. And so my question is this, before I get long-winded, would it be fair to say that in this model, pre-existence is a matter of, more of a theological recognition rather than like a type of biography of a heavenly individual? And, with that in mind, how should that impact our reading of the prologue of John with the wisdom viewpoint?
Well, naturally, you got to figure out what or who pre-exists or what was there. I mean, even if we want to remove the word pre-existence, just wisdom was up there in heaven with God in a variety of Jewish portrayals. Okay, well, what is wisdom or who is wisdom? Okay, well, if we look at our Old Testament, okay, look at our Hebrew Bible, when wisdom is most heavily used, which is really the book of Proverbs 1 through 9, it's overwhelmingly a personification, not a conscious female person. If you're going to say it's a person, you have to say it's a female. You're not talking about the preexistence of a son. You're saying a preexistence of a daughter. Okay, so if you're going to go that route, you have to be consistent with the whole thing. All right, you have Proverbs 28. You got that poem. You got Psalm 104 verse 24, and that's really, there's a couple of passages that talk about God creating through wisdom. There's one in Jeremiah where it's like in chapter 10 and chapter 51 where it's like copied verbatim, where God creates through his wisdom, through his understanding. It's clear that wisdom is just another way of talking about God's understanding. It's God wisely ordering as a wise architect, not as a clumsy, drunken fool. God is wisely ordering his good creation as a master craftsman. I get that. I see it. Okay. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. So that's that the wisdom was up there with God, and God used it without saying that wisdom is the creator. God is the creator. Yahweh is the creator. Yahweh with wisdom, or Yahweh by wisdom. Typically, it's with the Hebrew preposition ba, second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In wisdom or with wisdom. But I think actually in the Septuagint of Psalm 104, verse 24, where it says, with wisdom you created all these things, it actually puts it in the dative case, which actually helps with Colossians 1:15. But anyway, so it's wisdom that was up there with God. But if wisdom's not a conscious person, then I'm not really sure, how strong we can push the preexistence. I could say that. I could say, wisdom preexisted up there. Wisdom is up there before all creation. That's fine. That's okay. But if wisdom and word are functionally parallel terms, or at least they overlap in their functions, you can already see this in the Old Testament. You can already see it in Proverbs. You can already see wisdom saying in Proverbs chapter 1 that I will pour out my spirit on you. I will have my words come forth from my mouth. I will make my words known to you. So there, wisdom gives the words of God. You can already see it. There's a variety. I document all these in chapter 2 of the book. And the biggest one is in Wisdom Solomon chapter 9, verses 1-2, which just, if you don't commit intertestamental passages to memory, that's the one you want to do. Wisdom Solomon chapter 9, verses 1-2. Oh God, the God of our fathers, you've made all things with your word, and you've created humanity with your wisdom. So like in the same sentence, he makes all things with his word and with his wisdom. And it's clear at that point, and I think Wisdom Solomon predates the New Testament. It shows that in Judaism, you could basically say both of them together. And of course, you have portrayals of God creating through his word and God creating through his wisdom in the Old Testament. So it's thoroughly Jewish. So by the time you get to the prologue, if you see all of these things that were said about God's word, and I document 20 of them in my book, in chapter 3, that have parallels, that have clear parallels of things that were formerly said about God's wisdom, then it's very likely that the readers and the author either read it or intended to see these things said about the word that also could conceivably have been said about God's wisdom, which again raises another point as to whether the original draft was actually talking about wisdom, and if at the last moment it was changed to in the beginning was the word, to better accompany the Christological portrayal of the Johannine Jesus as the spokesperson of God, as the one that's speaking God's words, as the prophet, as the agent that is communicating God's oracles. So I know it's kind of a big fat answer to your question.
That was great. Could I add one more piece to it? Not because, as you were saying, you got my wheels kind of turned a little bit. Still within that vein, because that's something I know I've tried to zero in on a little bit more as of late, the interchangeable nature of Logos and Sophia within the Second Temple period context. And again, I'm still looking at your work here that I have. You talked, I think it's on page 35, about word and wisdom effectively functioning as synonymous categories when referring to God's instrumental ages of creation. If word and wisdom function synonymously in Jewish creation theology, outside of, I guess, maybe gender alignment, do you think there could possibly maybe be a use of logos because it could be considered the express form of wisdom? And maybe that's what John is trying to emphasize, or I guess outside of the stronger gender correlation, what are some other reasons that may be underlying that?
So I try to answer this question because this is a question that actually gets raised by the commentators on the Gospel of John and the specialists in the prologue. And what I put in the book is that I think that portraying Jesus as the embodiment of the Word more naturally helps fill out his portrayal later in the narrative as the one that speaks God's commandments, that speaks God's words, that speaks God's oracles, as the communicator of God's words and oracles to his people. He's the mouthpiece. I think also there's this portrayal in the Gospel of John that it is there in the book of Acts, but it's primarily there in the Gospel of John, that Jesus is the prophet from Deuteronomy 18:18. In Deuteronomy 18:18, Yahweh says, I'm going to raise up a prophet like you, Moses, and I'm going to put my words in his mouth. And so I've got a variety of episodes on on my podcast where I go through and I show every possible way in which the Gospel of John deliberately and intentionally takes that portrayal from Deuteronomy 18, really it's verses 15 through 22, and it portrays Jesus in that way. And so I think naturally portraying Jesus as the embodiment of God's logos more naturally conveys the prophet from Deuteronomy 18, in which Yahweh puts his own words, Devarim, into the mouth of this prophet. So he could have said wisdom, and it's very likely that the readers were reading these things and said, okay, that also makes sense with wisdom as well. But I just think logos, which is grammatically masculine, as you rightly pointed out, more naturally conveys this Christological illustration that the author is trying to convey.
So you just believe it's a transitionary aspect by which they're conveying the previous to the current state of God's revelation. And so that's the potential of masculine versus the feminine. And
yeah. I don't put so much stock on the masculine versus feminine thing, because I actually think that the earliest Christological view was that Jesus was the embodiment of wisdom. I actually think the historical Jesus believed that. I believe that he thought that he was the embodiment of wisdom. So let's just pinpoint that. If you're kind of doing a mental time chart, that's put that there in the 30s. Okay, then you have the creation of the Q document that is sourcing Matthew and Luke. Okay, potentially there in the 40s or 50s, we don't know, but definitely in the 50s and 60s, you've got Paul, who was portraying Jesus deliberately as the embodiment of God's wisdom in Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, if you attribute Ephesians to Paul, definitely Colossians, going through my head. You have Hebrews, which we'll just say roughly around the year 70, that also, like the first 4 verses, has a variety of things that are said about Jesus in terms of God's wisdom. And then you have, of course, you have Matthew and Luke. You have a couple things in the Gospel of Mark that might say that. I do think Mark was written first. And then since the whole Johannine literature of the Gospel of John and the letters, I think, are written either to the same community or from the same community, or at least from the same school of thought per se. You have that phrase, the unique one, which older translations say only begotten, but the adjective monogenes is no longer understood as dealing with generating. It actually deals with genus, like one of a kind, unique one. So that also appears in 1 John, so you have it there as well. So wisdom Christology was already there, and it was thoroughly preached in the Gospels and by Paul, and believed by, I think, the historical Jesus for the first 2 generations of the early Christian period. It's only when you get to the Gospel of John that the author says, let's take these wisdom things and let's turn them into logos things, even though the readers, and I think the author, knew that those things are so closely aligned that you really couldn't separate the wisdom parallels. At least that's the argument that I put in the book. So, but I've just found that when I talk to lay people and I say, do you even know what wisdom Christology is? They gave me this blank stare. They've never heard about this. And so it hasn't been conveyed very well, which is why in my systematic theology of the early church, I dedicate an entire chapter in the Christology section to wisdom Christology and logos Christology, because this is part of what the early church believed. And we've done a terrible job at conveying this to the average interested laypersons. And I'm trying to be a part of that solution. So, by the way, if for the readers that want to know what I think most recently about wisdom Christology and logos Christology, it's actually the systematic theology book, to where the wisdom Christology in the Gospel of John is just a year behind, but it's far more focused on the 4th Gospel there.
And I have that book, so can't wait to delve into that one. So that's going to be a joyful read. So, Dr. Smith, we wanted to get into some comparative theology. We're a little bit over time on the other part of our discussion, but I know we want to get into some interacting, and I know you have questions for us as well. So we definitely don't want to limit your time on that. So do you want any one of us to kind of do a general overview of Oneness Christology, or and how that works in incarnation, or?
No, I feel like I've got a good feel for it, and I imagine most of the listeners that are subscribed to your show here are probably going to be oneness persons, and they probably don't need a review of those basic points. correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just kind of put my finger in the air and seeing where the wind is blowing.
Yeah.
But I guess part of what you do whenever you write something is you listen to feedback and you hear, okay, did people find this persuasive or did they not find it persuasive? Okay, did they not find it persuasive because I'm a terrible writer, or do the dots not add up, or is it just a bad argument? There are a couple of things in the book that I do think that I have made some legitimate contributions, even though I do think that I've kind of really taken a lot of the scholarly work from the last 100 years and just kind of like compiled it together. And, I would say, like 90% of the book is not my own thought. I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of other smarter people. I do think there are a couple of contributions in the book that I think are unique to me, that I do think help push the dialogue forward when it comes to this topic of incarnation, because I think that's when it comes to whatever Christology you have, how you understand the incarnation is very, very vital. And I tend to notice that there are different ways of understanding the incarnation, whether you're a Unitarian, a oneness person, a Trinitarian, or an Arian. They have 4 different ways of interpreting it. Okay, which means we can't agree on this. All right.
Right.
So my questions deal with that sort of topics. Or are you guys okay talking?
Oh, absolutely.
About
Yes.
that?
Yeah, for sure.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
So in chapter 2, one of the things that I tried to demonstrate is that the Jewish idea of incarnation did not begin with the prologue of John. It was already there 500 years earlier in the book of Proverbs. And this is one of these interesting stories. So probably like 10 years ago, I was translating through Proverbs, and I got to Proverbs chapter 31, and I noticed that, so in Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31, you have this big section about the ideal wife or the excellent woman. It typically gets preached during Mother's Day, and it's got all these different descriptions. The only part of Proverbs is deliberately written to women, to where the rest of Proverbs is deliberately written to men. And so women like it. They talk about being a Proverbs 31 woman. Maybe your wives know all about this. Maybe they have, a pillow. This is on a Proverbs 31 woman stitched on it or something like that. Okay. So, but what I found is that there are all these descriptions of these real life women that if you are a male reader of Proverbs, you're supposed to be seeking after this type of woman. And if you are a female reader, you're supposed to be emulating these things. But the descriptions of these women draw from the very Hebrew words and phrases that were formerly used to describe God's wisdom in Proverbs 1 through 9. And I saw 1 or 2 of them, and I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And then I was like, okay, there's another one, there's another one, there's another one. And I was like, okay, something's going on here. Like, this is not an axiom. The author is deliberately portraying these women as the embodiment of this pre-existent personification. And then I went and looked in the commentaries, and I'm like, oh, great. They've all known about this for a long time, but nobody reads commentaries on Proverbs 31. So, but that was interesting because it shows that the idea, because this is the same sort of thing that the writers of the New Testament did. They would take things formerly said about God's wisdom and they would apply them to the man Jesus Christ. Not to say that Jesus consciously preexisted as wisdom, but that Jesus was the embodiment of wisdom. Okay, so I thought that was, not only was that a very strong argument that I was making, but also I documented and I footnoted all the scholars that I could find. And it was that chapter that you look at the page of the footnote. It's I think there's probably like more footnotes than there are actually pages there, because there's a wide consensus, a large consensus among experts on Proverbs that the concept of incarnation, as we see it in the New Testament, is already there in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Proverbs. Okay, so before I go any further, did you find that persuasive? Do you disagree with it? Do you even remember what I'm talking about there? Give me some feedback with that, with that argument. That's in chapter 2 on the section on.
Yes. I found it interesting. So I haven't quite come to a conclusion on it, just because I realized for what I was doing in my paper that I didn't really have to come to a conclusion. And like you said, you made valid points. It definitely helps my idea. Like when I came away with my paper, the idea of incarnation is, I think it's a lot of Greek categories to put it as this incarnation is this big thing of what God is. God, divine hypostasis, or the second divine hypostasis of the Godhead, came down and put on human attributes or assumed human attributes. I find that view of incarnation not very in line with the text. I find it more in terms of who God is and the embodiment of God. And not necessarily, again, metaphysically God putting on a piece of skin, but like more so someone or a creation embodying the presence and power of God. And so I do find in that aspect, there is, when I think about it, there is a much, I can see a good argument for it. That I'm sorry, I'm not really providing much feedback as far as pushback, but as far as what I got, it doesn't. I haven't seen any reason to say like, no, that's bad logic. If that makes sense.
Brandon?
Yeah, I guess to kind of piggyback on what was already said, I was kind of in reading it, which really sparked my interest. I was kind of shocked by how much of this kind of correlates to kind of how we're seeing this context of wisdom, especially in the context of incarnation. Dealing with the female aspect of it, I'm still feeling my way out on that, but I can say as what it does lay the groundwork in, like within the prologue, how it connects to the temple narrative. I think that's a pretty important part, which is more where I see it. I guess as it relates to the feminine aspect of it, I'm still feeling that one out. I am curious to, I guess, think about as far as, I guess, wisdom in the feminine context being related to the other religions in their context. I guess I'm trying to see, are there other cross-cultural aspects where incarnation could be even maybe hinting at from a larger perspective, or is this something that's just unique to the Jewish or the Second Temple period worldview?
Yeah, so what you find in the description, the socioeconomic description of these women in Proverbs 31, 10 through 31, is that they're living in the Persian period. So this is post-exilic, okay? They're living in their own land. They're able to own their land. They're able to to make things, to create things. They're able to own property. They're able to buy things. They're able to sell things. They're able to make a profit. They're able to assume that their husbands are at the city gates. It assumes kind of a post-exilic standpoint there. It's not the period of monarchy. This is the experts that have worked on this have kind of dated this to the Persian period. So there's not Greek concepts. The Greek concepts haven't even entered into the picture. Like the Judaism has not been influenced with Greek thought or language or anything like that. It's in the Persian period. It's not in the Greek period. Okay, so we're thinking like 500, something like that. But it's the things that were the ideals of wisdom, the things that were describing wisdom, are now being used to describe these women in ways that show that they are embodying the principles of the book of Proverbs. They're embodying God's wise teachings, because really the way you would seek after God's wisdom as an Old Testament person would be to go after God's wise commandments in the Torah. They were embodying those in real ways. But I think one of the things that I also did was I also was able to trace how this portrayal in Proverbs 31 affected other Jewish works between Proverbs. Proverbs is a starting point, and the New Testament. And so after that, you have Sirach, where you have, again, personified wisdom there in the beginning with God as the agent of creation who comes down in a temple, and then it actually gets embodied not in a female figure, but actually in a male figure, not hypothetical women that are, your hypothetical mate, but actually in a real high priest that we can know and date. We know his name, and it's Simon ben Onias. Okay, so we know that. So that's there in the 2nd century BC. Okay, and then the third document is actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's called the Genesis Apocryphon, 1Q20, where you have things that were formerly said about God's wisdom now being used to describe Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Okay, and so Sarah there is the embodiment of God's wisdom. And you can see she seems to be a wise person sometimes when Abraham's doing some silly things. And then when you get to Philo, which is there at the beginning of the 1st century, but before any of the writings of the New Testament, you have Philo, who I think is actually influenced by Proverbs and Sirach, but not influenced by 1Q20. Philo will put 4 successive women and describe them as the embodiment of God's wisdom. Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Zipporah. Okay, and he'll flat out say, like in the Greek, because you can get the Greek of Philo and you can look at it, he'll actually say, Sarah is wisdom, and he won't even use the verb to be. It's just like Sarah wisdom, boom. Like he equates them, but he doesn't mean that Sarah consciously preexisted up there in heaven. It's just Sarah's, it's showing that this understanding from Proverbs 31 was deeply impactful to a variety of other Jewish persons. Okay, and so when the New Testament comes along in the 1st century and they start to say, actually, God's wisdom is embodied in Jesus, they're not saying anything brand new, and they're definitely not importing Greek categories. They're saying something that's thoroughly Jewish, something that has been around for hundreds of years. It's already there in the Hebrew Bible and Proverbs. And if you're reading the Septuagint, it's already there in Sirach as well. It's there already in the first century with the writings of Philo. So that's why I think it's really, really interesting, because it shows that the portrayal of Jesus, the embodiment of wisdom, or even the prologue, the portrayal of Jesus, the embodiment of God's word, is not a Greek concept. It's not a Greek invasion of the text. It's thoroughly Jewish. It's rooted in the Hebrew Bible, and it's orthodox in that sense. That's why I think the argument is interesting. But here's my gentle pushback with all of you guys. Okay, you would not say that the women in Proverbs 31, or the historical high priest Simon ben Onias, or Sarah, or Leah, or Rebecca, or Zipporah, are impersonal human natures that are attached to God the Father, in the way that you understand Jesus as the incarnation of God's word or God's wisdom. So for me, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, if I'm trying to be consistent, if I'm trying to interpret the prologue consistently in its Jewish context, which I've clearly laid out for hundreds of years, then we have to see Jesus as the embodiment of a personification while still being a real person, a real genuine person, a real genuine human being. This is why I thought it was so interesting when you all came to me and you said you found my work really interesting, because I thought this is the part to where it doesn't, I'm not seeing how it lines up there. So anyway, go ahead. I'm getting really excited because this is. I think this is a contribution to the conversation.
Yeah, there's several.
Sure.
Yeah, there's several aspects that I think when you're dealing with a lot of oneness, I think there's some considerations that are not truly hashed out correctly. When we see Jesus as a true, authentic man, right? Who grows in wisdom and stature, learns good, and reject evil. All the things that you probably very well know that we believe on that side. We believe that he has true consideration of his existence as growing as a true man. He only knows himself according to revelation and his upbringing, just like all men do. So when we believe he is the perfection of the infinite God as true man, this doesn't, there is no manipulation or coercion or force by God's existence. It's God's purpose and intent to be expressed as the perfection of his wisdom as man. So when we look at the man, the very reality of his existence is that perfection of God, but as true man.
Just to clarify, there is the man Jesus a conscious person, a real person, distinct from the Father?
Well, this is where we would push back, because see, what happens when we use the term person, there's an issue. The normality of the term person is the consideration of one subject, right? But if God is choosing to express himself in a unique way, in which has a relational value, even according to himself. So one of the questions or one of the statements and questions I ask people is this: can God truly manifest himself as a true, authentic man with a true, authentic human existence, with true, authentic human relationships? That's the primary question. That's where everything stands. So if the answer is yes, okay, what is the necessary realities of this self-expression of the infinite to the finite, right? So when we look at man, this man, when you say person, this is the qualification. Person is not a norm to a unique existence, because now you're having God expressed as something that's ontologically distinct from his own being, right? It's distinct in relationship to himself. God expressed as man. God obviously knows himself exhaustively, and he knows his self-expression exhaustively. But the self-expression is God's intent to redeem mankind by personal expression. So that man has psychological relationships as all men do. Now, is that person? Well, from a psychological sense, we can say yes, but from an independent standpoint, it's God's purpose and intent. So we have to think of it as top modeling down. It starts with God's purpose and intent. We believe Jesus is God, not because he's pointing to ontological factors. We believe Jesus is God because God's decree is to express himself as true man. So therefore, that divine expression that means Jesus, by source of being out of the Holy Spirit and source of origin, is God. So when we say, okay, well, Jesus lacked wisdom, knowledge, all these things, we agree, because that's the point intent of God, is to be realized ontologically as true man with true relationships. So is Jesus a person? If you want to consider a Lokian sense of person, which has to do with psychological factors by which he grows and understands himself, yes. Is it in the sense of an independent person? No, because it's God's willing to exist as such. So the reality of God existing as such is true to its existence, which is a true man. So, well, go on. I'm rambling, so I don't want.
Oh, no, you're good. Yeah, the way I've always it kind of, when I've done this research, explained it, is that ultimately, when it comes down to our conclusion, we believe that Jesus isn't God ontologically, but is God expressed as man. And with that, we have to understand the implications of oneness. And this is why I think your book made me a better oneness and helped me understand. Because there was moments, I'm not gonna lie to you, there was moments where I was talking to my wife, I was talking to my mom, and like, am I going Unitarian? But when I kind of get down to like the narrowest distinctions of everything, I realized and started reading some of our documents that this is thoroughly oneness in our point of view, and that is Jesus as a man and everything, right? It's ultimately God expressed in the sense of God did the expressing into creation, but we always have to take into account how God expressed himself. Technically expressed himself in this case for the purpose of our salvation as a human person. This person has relationship to God. He loves God. He's going to be seated at the right hand of the Father and all this stuff as the perfect representation of God. I would always use the term, if God were man ontologically, that'd be Jesus Christ. But in terms of actual ontology, no, there's obviously the divine spirit and then the man Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is that kind of, because that's kind of how I view with the wisdom stuff here. Like that's what my paper was, is that I believe that wisdom, personified wisdom, was God's expressing his wise interaction, expressing himself into creation as the creative order throughout the world. And that's kind of what you have that thing going on. And ultimately that creative order is most perfectly expressed and always intended to be expressed in and as the man Jesus Christ.
And don't want to take up too much time, just adding on to that. I also think about the as Elise Sennett says in her book, the personification of wisdom, how, of course, as you know this, probably, I would say, yeah, for a fact, better than I do, the aspects of Israel's identity as it related to the divine, with the loss of the temple, the priesthood, their placement in the land, all of these were cultic symbols of Yahweh's presence among his people, which was, all the way from Exodus. It was God personally, not through another, but he himself dwelling. And at least from my vantage point, looking at it, and I think the conclusion that those things draw is that when we get to Jesus, yes, the chief architecture is wisdom, which I think you do a beautiful job at really showing. But I see the fulfillment of these things that, especially as you get to the prologue, he, especially when you get to, we'll say, he dwelt among us and uses the, I believe it's the verb for tabernacle among us that you have in the Septuagint, which communicates that not only is this the wisdom to better that was active in creation, but this is what wisdom really was, which was God himself among his people. And I would say, especially in the context of John writing to people in Ephesus, who I would imagine have a good understanding of the literature, that would really speak to them in that context, and not to be too wordy.
Sure. Well, just in the sense of being consistent, because one of the things that I'm trying to do is in trying to situate the Gospel of John and really early Christian Christology. And this is the last question I'll ask, because we can go on about this for a while. In trying to situate it in its Jewish context, I'm trying to say, okay, you got the Jewish context first, and then you fit the New Testament into it. Okay, it's the New Testament's kind of like the top block on the pyramid that's already built. Okay, if that context already has incarnation and embodiment of God's wisdom, okay, would you take your interpretation of John 1:14 and equally and fairly apply it to Proverbs 31, to Sirach, to 1Q20, and to Philo in his portrayals of the very same portrayal of human beings that embody the very same wisdom?
I think,
would you be consistent?
Yeah, I realized that we didn't answer that part of the question. So I was about to say
Yeah,
something, but
yeah.
thank you for re-inviting that question. I think to be consistent, I would say that in a sense, yes, you would apply that consistently, but there is one caveat, and that is that Jesus Christ is the full expression of God, whereas the others would not be. So if you have some type of incarnational language, and with the wisdom kind of language there, and kind of this is my big thing with Paul and like the Torah and stuff. It's like there is this two ways logic, and you're trying to embody one way. Well, Jesus is the perfection of that embodiment, unlike Sarah, unlike any other model. And the only reason why in this text, at least in the text what I see with the virgin birth and all this stuff, the reason why I can say this is that ultimately, for the purpose of our salvation and to release the Spirit out to us, so that we can, kind of partake in this, he fully expressed himself in the creation as man. And so I think there's a little bit. Do you see the distinction I'm making there? Like how there is still a difference between Jesus and them because of him being the full incarnation. And I'm not meaning, again, like in the metaphysical categories of Greek, of a divine hypostasis, assumed humanity. I think incarnation I think a more Jewish sense of incarnation would be the embodiment of who God is, his presence and power, being fully present in and as the man Jesus Christ. I don't think you see that with the other.
I hear the argument you're making. I don't see the distinction that's being made. I don't get the impression that all the former other Jewish references are saying these are only partial incarnations or they're incomplete incarnations. They make the same arguments that the New Testament authors are doing, which is that you take this human person,
right,
and you apply to him the roles and the characteristics and the qualities and the attributes formerly belonging to God's wisdom. So it seems to be, again, something that's thoroughly Jewish. And all of those persons, you would say, are fully human persons in the same way that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 fully human persons on this show right now.
Right. Do you think, okay, like with that, because I'm actually interested in that, would they do similar concepts like for in him dwells all the fullness of God? Would they apply that kind of verbiage to those other contexts and incarnational things, or are you just simply talking about certain attributes of wisdom? Just for like clarification's sake.
Just to add to that real quick,
Sure.
What do you perceive as the distinction between Jesus? Because I get this, different positions from Unitarians. There's just like there's a wide range of. What is your view of what makes Jesus unique, right? Because I think that's where the discussion generally has to go, because somehow Jesus is unique to the billions of people before him. What makes it unique? How is he the exact representation? How is he the image of the invisible God? How is those things? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because even those phrases, exact representation or image, which show up there in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, are all drawing on portrayals of wisdom in Wisdom of Solomon chapter 7.
Exactly.
So it's so that language is already there. But again, that again is the writers of the New Testament taking qualities of wisdom and applying them to Jesus in the same way that these former Jewish writers took their own qualities of wisdom and applied them to these human persons. So what makes Jesus different? I think the obvious thing is that Jesus is the Messiah. Okay. The other people are not. Okay. You could say Jesus is sinless. The other people are not. But again, I see Jesus as a human person in the same way that everyone else is a human person. But our Christologies have a different understanding of how Jesus is a human person, and we don't have to hash that out or try to litigate that whole thing. I think I get where you're coming from on that whole thing. It's just to me, that's what I see as one of the strengths of my reading of the prologue as a biblical Unitarian, is that it maintains consistency with the portrayals of incarnation from these other Jewish sources, to where I'm seeing an argument that, we need to make an exception of Jesus here, which is that's your argument. That's fine. But this is me hearing the feedback and thinking, okay, you did not find my argument persuasive on this particular point.
No, actually, I do. But my only thing is that I think that the Torah, when we follow the law, we are embodying, because like Christ in us is the perfection of law, right? So there's the medium change between that which we perceive through lenses of flesh and through hearing and seeing, versus the new covenant by which there is a perfection that is Christ in you and the Spirit dwells, right? So there's a being born of water and a spirit. From our point of view, we see there's a difference between post Pentecost and pre Pentecost, right? Post death, burial, and resurrection, the point in time by which Christ is now and the Spirit is dwelling in us. Now it's the law of Christ in us. So we would say that Christ is. I totally agree with you, because all those are in part bearing the divine image, right? When you follow the law, you're bearing the image of God, what He wants for you to do. We would just say that Christ is the perfection of that image, by which is uniqueness as true man, but ultimately for redemption as a kinsman redeemer. So I agree with you what you're saying. I just say that Jesus is the fullness. And as you said, it doesn't say partial, because when we obey the laws, we walk in the path, the halakha, we are embodying God, right? But the divine expression, as we would say, is that perfection as man, as true man. So, I understand what your point is saying, and it's a great point. I mean, I don't disagree at all. I think it's great. I think it's great information.
Could I? And I apologize. I'm not sure what's happening with my camera. I'm gonna just say, so if my wife was in here, she should be able to fix it. So since she's not, I'm gonna blame her. So because she's not in here. But looking at the personification of wisdom as a tool to communicate the attributes of God, of course, we probably hold closer to divine simplicity on that. If wisdom, at least from my understanding, is for lack of a better phrase, a poetic circumlocution to describe the literal action of God in the world, I guess when we look at this in its context, or better yet, to talk about it from this, when we have Jesus, I guess, being described in these ways, or guess, would you not, and I know you would say it goes a little bit further, but I guess, like when we talk about wisdom, we know we're not talking about a literally distinct person from the Father, but a poetic way of describing his actions. How would this not be almost putting him in a category, I guess, that would be unheard of until now, or until that time, it was said almost?
Well, I know that's my point, is that I think that with all the evidence that I'm laying out, it's not an unheard of category. It is thoroughly Jewish, and it was relevant there in the first century. It's rooted in the Hebrew Bible, and the same strategies of describing a person as the embodiment of wisdom by taking roles, traits, characteristics, and actions formerly belonging to wisdom and applying them to human persons that we have with all these other Jewish works was the same interpretive strategy by the historical Jesus and the earliest writers of the Bible, the Gospels, the Gospel John, Paul, Hebrews. It's the same thing. So to me, I see continuity there, not discontinuity.
Yeah, no.
While still admitting that Jesus is the Messiah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
And my last, and I'm gonna want to let everybody continue to talk, but I guess thinking especially like in the context of Colossians, where it's very much coming from a cosmic perspective. These parallels, which is one of the things I know as one as Pentecostals, we really have had to wrestle with the dia with the genitive and such. Him being ascribed to these roles, I guess, in a context of creation, and of course within wisdom language. And please forgive me if I'm asking the same question over again and maybe going over my head, but do we have a precedent for that within the Second Temple period?
Of
like
God creating through his wisdom?
Or better yet, like that being seen through someone but himself, I guess, like, or you
Okay.
Am I making sense there?
So here, I understand the Colossian hymn as beginning with creation and moving to redemption. But again, it takes something like 8 or 9 different, it's another one of these places to where 8 or 9 different things that were formerly said about God's wisdom are now being said about Jesus. Now, by the time of the writing of Colossians, which was one of the later letters, Paul's Wisdom Christology has already been laid out. It's already been laid out among his churches. And we know you've already alluded to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, which is the very same thing that's said in Colossians 1:15. It's God creating through his wisdom, now understood as Christ. Okay, so it's the very same. It's that sort of God is the creator, the Father is the creator, and he creates through his wisdom, now understood as Jesus. But in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4, Paul takes something that was formerly said about God's wisdom, now applies it to Jesus, and he says, I am talking to you in types, and I'm talking to you typologically, because the way that Paul understands wisdom that was there in the beginning and Jesus right now is through typology. That's his understanding of it. That's how he tells us. That's his hermeneutic that he gives us, and he gives us the answers to that, okay? So if we take these things that are said about Jesus in the Colossian hymn, in 1:15 through 20, and you look at all the things that are formerly said about it in Jewish literature, and I document all these in episodes of my podcast, you can see, again, he's typologically doing this with Jesus in the same way that was being done with these Old Testament figures. Now, granted, we're not going to have the women in Proverbs chapter 31 being described as the agents of creation, but we will have Proverbs telling us that a wife is a gift from God, as in God gives you that wife from heaven. Okay, well, because that woman, that wife, is the embodiment of God's wisdom, which is up there in heaven. Okay, so it's not completely unprecedented, but obviously, while the Jews would say that God can invest his wisdom in a variety of persons, successive persons, when it comes to Jesus, he's now the full climactic embodiment of wisdom, and there's not going to be anyone else after Jesus in whom God is going to invest his wisdom. So that does make Jesus kind of the climactic final point of the whole thing. But it sounds like we need to have a whole nother conversation. We talk about Wisdom Christology and the rest of the New Testament.
Absolutely.
There's so much
great
in it.
Yeah.
So,
real quick, in John, do you see uniqueness though in his words? Right, Jesus doesn't speak. His manner of speech is unique. It's not like a normal man. While he may submit like all men do, have a God, pray, hunger, thirst, pray out of necessity because he must. His speech is unique. For example, when Philip says to him, Lord, show us the Father, that should satisfy us. When he says, have you not been so long with you, yet you have not known me? He that has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? That's a unique question that I ask, Trinitarians as well, because to them, they can't say, show us the Father. Because, I'm the second person of the Godhead. I'm not that guy. So my question would be is, Jesus speaks very uniquely. The words I speak to you, I speak not of myself, but what the Father is giving me commandment to say. So the speech of Christ seems to be very unique in its origin, its submission, and its delivery. What are your thoughts on that? In just simply, I understand it's true humanity, but how do you perceive that in your view?
Well, I think of the Gospel, John, Jesus is God's agent. I think that's unambiguously clear. Jesus is the one who's been sent by God. God is the one that sends. Jesus calls himself the apostle in John 13:16. And the agent in the Jewish world fully represents the sender in every possible way. So as the agent, Jesus can say, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, while not collapsing the sender and the agent into one person. That's not how the principle of agency works. Principle of agency involves two persons, and even the passage you read there. If I could just be a little cheeky here, I don't do things of myself. That's a pronoun. I do things from the Father. Those are two persons. You brought that passage up there. So
yeah, I mean, we don't have a problem with distinction of psychology and true recognition and submission by the true Son according to his existence. We totally agree with that. If you want to talk about a psychological person who truly only knows himself according to his existence and has true submission and prayer and thirst and does all those things, absolutely. We don't conflate, manipulate, or coerce the distinctions because it's God's purpose to exist as true man. So we consider all of the factors in what it means to be true man. We don't play what we call skin suit oneness or Apollinarianism. And in that sense, we believe Jesus is God's true intent to exist as the consideration of what it means to be man. That means everything, not just God using him as a mouthpiece and it's fake. No, that's not it.
Yeah, and even like for us, again, it's not like this metaphysical. And I keep saying this because, like, I used to say, like, oh, we believe in incarnation just like the Trinitarians do, but how a lot of Trinitarians describe it, that's not how I view incarnation at all. Again, I don't believe a divine person literally put on human attributes. I think that it's more so that the divine person expressed into creation in the sense that this is a full human person in our viewpoint. Still, he still has a relationship to God, but the difference is, like, I wouldn't even say it's really a difference between us and you, because in your book I feel like you say something very similar to what I would say, and that is that he's the fullness of God's character and presence expressed into humanity. And to me, that is different than the rest of, I guess, the other what you would call incarnational passages. And I want to reread that, and I definitely provide more thorough feedback. I didn't realize that was like my point was more so in, like, I'm not as well read in Philo. So, like, when I started reading Philo, I read it, but, like,
Who is?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
I know a guy, he's Eastern Orthodox. He was oneness. He Philo is his thing. He's been a student of Philo for 12 years, and he says he understands Philo. I don't think he does.
Is he married?
Apparently, for him, apparently he needs the church to read the scriptures, but he doesn't need theologians or scholars to read Philo because he has eyes. That's what he told me. But I'm like, yeah, treat that with scripture. But anyway, that's a whole nother thing. But no, yeah, you did bring an interesting point there, and I think I was talking to you, Chris, about, like, I was wondering, like, how far you would go with the incarnation, because I knew where you were going with it. I just didn't have enough knowledge in some of the books it covered, other than, like, Wisdom of Solomon and stuff, to really get good feedback. So I do appreciate that contribution.
Sure.
I would say, try not to get, but I would say the way that you have, expressed this, it has highlighted to me a greater need within the oneness Christological expression to very much address, because I'm like, there's some points of this that we haven't addressed, and I think it highlighted to me some of our tunnel vision, and our, a little bit of embarrassment just arguing with Trinitarians all the time. And I say, yeah, we need to definitely expand our articulation in these areas, because this showed a big blind spot for us.
Right.
Yeah, because just to let you know, we believe in Jesus as a God now. We believe there's the true considerations of God as true man, is a glorified man in heaven, reigning as high priest, mediator between God and man, all those things, because that's what's needed as a kinsman redeemer. So we don't negate simply because there's a resurrection, Jesus somehow morphed back into God as some good night. But yeah, Revelations 3, where Jesus has a God, unto the temple of my God, this, all those things. So we see the necessity of God expressing himself as to bring forward a true kinsman redeemer, in that, one, he's the prototype, he's the image of what we will be. Therefore, we are co-inheritors. We're all those things. So Jesus fills the role as true man in every applicable way. He's the perfection of the infinite God as true man. And that is true man. And I emphasize that all the time, because if you don't have true man, you don't have a kinsman redeemer. You have a fake Christ. You have a fake sacrifice, fake justification, fake everything. There's no true justification before, and to be declared righteous in all your doings, to be glorified, and to sit at the right hand of power, reigning and given power and authority, which means it's not intrinsic. It's something that is given to you in Matthew 28:18. So we consider these necessities of what God's purpose and intent is to redeem as true man.
Yeah. I'm sitting here, I'm nodding my head on all those things there too, because that's for me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have Unitarians agree.
It's the death of a human being that atoned for our sins, and that's something Trinitarians and even Arians struggle with.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. It has to be a man to obtain those legal rights and those legal positions. If otherwise, if God could do it in his transcendency, what's the point of the man? That doesn't even make any sense. That's God's wisdom, his order. God obeys his wisdom and his order. That's the glory of God's wisdom, is true man, redeeming mankind. The question is obviously between our positions is what's the origin and the purpose intent of God? Is it God to perfectly express himself by wisdom as man, or is somehow wisdom, the Christ, the embodiment of wisdom in a unique way as others would vary it?
Yeah, hopefully we can all agree that John 1:14 says it's the word that became flesh. And so
Amen.
This is why I labor to define what that word or what that wisdom actually is. So probably on that point of agreement, we should try to find a way to land this plane.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Hopefully we can have more discussions. I truly enjoy listening to your interactions and dialogue.
Love your podcast.
Absolutely. We truly appreciate you coming on, and everyone's have great respect for you, and we thank you. Tim, thank you for coming on. Brother Nero also coming on. I appreciate every one of you, and hopefully we can continue these discussions and research the points he's brought up even more and come to a better conclusion and or spectrum of understanding of how those are possible. So thank you, Dr. Smith, for everything you've and coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
God bless. I appreciate you.
Bless you.
Thank you all. And well, everyone, one of the things that I wanted to do is that in this, there is you have Dr. Smith here, you have Tim and Brother Nero. Of course, obviously Moses left. I wanted to say that, do you have your book? I want to bring that up real quick, just to make sure they got it.
Please buy this book. And
please buy that book. Yes, please buy that book. It's a great book, and also his new book. So that's another one. Do you have that one?
Yeah. Brandon forces me to keep them like right here by the computer.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Awesome. Yes, I just want to make sure because I forgot I wanted to promote that right before I left. Yeah. So thank you all.
Hardback copy.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thank you again. Appreciate y'all. Everyone, I appreciate you joining us and going through that discussion with Dr. Smith, and hope we learn something and we can grow from it, and obviously engage more on this subject, because ultimately God is not jumping back. He expects you to carry on the principles of understanding that he's already laid out in the Old Testament. Paul's not trying to recreate God. That's not Paul's point. Grace and peace be from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. There's a purpose and intent why Paul speaks the way he does. So when we understand the true humanity of Christ, whether Unitarian, oneness, or even Trinitarian, that's essential. And when we understand the Old Testament, I think it brings us closer to God's purpose and intent from the beginning to bring forth the consistent revelation of who he is. So I pray everyone has a great night, and thank you for joining us on Counterpoint Apologetics. God bless.